What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so continuing on with Marvel Legacy, the cool thing now is that we're getting into like February, March, April, which means a lot of these storylines are starting to wrap up. A lot of these are basically starting to come to an end to the point that we can actually start going through and covering a lot of these things. That's kind of the downside to when Marvel Legacy launched. Because so few people were watching videos that I was uploading on like All New, All Different Marvel or Marvel Now 2.0, we kind of had to wait till Marvel Legacy kicked off in order to really go back and start covering a lot of this stuff. And so when it comes to Old Man Logan, again, this is cool. I mean, this is one of those things where writer Ed Brisson kind of picks up the whole run of Jeff Lemire and does it in spectacular fashion. I mean, it's really cool the way it's done. But the cool thing about this too is that it also kind of delves into the history of Old Man Logan. Remember, that was kind of the cool thing about his character, is all we really knew is he hailed from a universe where the villains killed all the superheroes, and he was one of the last few people who had survived. He had killed all the X-Men, after being tricked by Mysterio. And again, when we have a huge playlist on X-Men stuff that you're welcome to go back and look at. But by and large, one of the things that Marvel never really explored here was like the origin of Old Man Logan. They did to a degree, but we were largely left to just kind of assume that the origin of Old Man Logan is almost identical to the origin of, classic Wolverine. And it is kind of interesting because we get these little confirmations here and there, but then we also get these small moments where things are a little bit different. But what this does is this initially picks up in Tokyo, in Japan. Nothing really out of the ordinary right off the bat anyway. I mean, it's just a handful of guys who throw some guy out of a bar and they're just kind of talking trash. But, again, this is part of the scene of Wolverine, of like Old Man Logan, the criminal underworld, that kind of a thing. But when they attack Old Man Logan, one of them basically begins to heal. And that's when the initial indication is given that, okay, maybe this is a mutant, this is a new kid on the block, some guy that's got a healing factor. But then Wolverine, basically the story tells us that Old Man Logan realizes this guy is not an inhuman and he's not a mutant. And so what that means is he gained his powers by some other source. Now, at this point, we pick up with the Yoshida Corporation. Now, here's a funny thing. I actually had to tweet out because I wasn't sure what happened to the original Silver Samurai. And apparently he died in 2010 in like Wolverine Volume 4, which I never realized. And for the most part, when it came to like the original Silver Samurai Harada, when it comes to like Shin Harada, they are really more like stewards of the Yoshida clan than anything else. And the reason why is because it is a it's a monarchy, basically, in the sense that what you end up having is this idea that the original Shinjin Yoshida basically started Clan Yoshida. He started this massive corporation, and then it was supposed to pass down from one generation to the next. Now, it did pass to Mariko Yoshida, and then she was killed. And so from there, the company went to control of her half-brother, the original Silver Samurai, and then after his death, it went to his illegitimate son, Shin Harada. But if somebody with part of the Yoshida bloodline were to come along and say, I'm retaking control of this company, there's nothing Shin could do to stop them because they legally have control of that company. He and the various Haradas are really more of like caretakers than anything else until a member of the Yoshida clan comes along with the correct bloodline. And so again, it is kind of interesting here, but the one thing to keep in mind is that we end up having this guy named Tuco who's basically being confronted by Shin. And the reason for this is because of the fact that they've been developing, or at least Yoshida Corporation has been developing something called Regenix, which is basically a drug that allows people to regenerate. Now, the other thing to remember here is that Shin is pretty cutthroat. And the reason why is because once he finds out this guy's stealing from the company, he just drops him off of a building. And that's really about it. And so it gets pretty brutal from there because it's really just kind of like these two paths crossing one another. Because Old Man Logan follows along and then ultimately comes across this, crazy clan, as they call themselves, crazy gang clan, whatever it is they call themselves, a crazy thunder clan. There we go. And it's basically them just kind of making a massive shipment that's going to go to Madripoor. Of course, Madripoor, as we know, being like this huge criminal underworld that exists out there, this, place where all the criminals just kind of stay and hang out and so on and so forth. Now, the battle that follows suit is pretty par for the course. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Not a whole lot going on there. It's basically this idea of Old Man Logan fighting against these various, guys that are using Regenix, and that's really about it. The caveat to this is that the fight makes its way into a cooler, and that's when Old Man Logan begins to realize that cool air actually slows down the healing factor or the abilities of Regenix, which basically grants him a reprieve, and essentially threatening one of these guys and saying, look, I'll cut your head off and then, you'll die, and then that'll be about it. And of course, the guy spills the beans and says, hey, look, here's everything that's going on, and we bought it from this guy who worked for Clan Yoshida, and so on and so forth. And so switching back to Shin, this is when things start to pick up. And the reason why is because while he's in his office, conducting business, suddenly he's met by the arrival of the Hand. Now, we've talked about the Hand before in Marvel Comics, and they're pretty extreme. For those of you guys who are not familiar with the Hand, way back, well, really the origins kind of fluctuate. I mean, really, it was like 1 billion years years ago, you kind of had these guys who worship the great evil beast, you know, or I guess really just the beast as they call them. But in terms of the actual hand as it exists now, that probably dates back more to like the 10th or 11th centuries. And it was this idea that there was a guy named Kaganobu Yoshioka who basically grabbed all these different villages that were, that really didn't like the Japanese government at the time, banded them all together, took them to the mountains, and then unified them under his control and rechristened the group the Hand. From that point, it was delving into like mysticism, things like that, because they already had a strong understanding of like the samurai code and martial arts and all different kinds of things. So they already knew how to fight effectively. And so that's kind of how the Hand rose to prominence. Now, the other half of this is the Hand is currently being led by Gorgon. Now, Gorgon is a relatively new character. I mean, he was created back in 2004 in like Wolverine Volume 3, issue number 20, and he was created by Mark Millar. And Gorgon is basically just a guy named Tomi Shishido, I think is how you pronounce his last name. But he's basically a mutant. He has like low-level telepathy, which means he can like read and somewhat influence the minds of others, but it's really more just reading the minds of others, combined with the fact that he has what's called the Gorgon stare, meaning if Gorgon were to remove the bandage from around his eyes, he would just turn to stone everything that he looks at. Every single organic organism or what have you that he looks at would turn into stone. And that's why he keeps his eyes bandaged. Now, in truth, his telepathy, whether, seeing through the eyes of others or what have you, allow him to, basically function. And of course, he's also an exceedingly smart human being. That's the funny thing about this, is that Gorgon's not just a soldier who's just really good at sword fighting. He's insanely intelligent. I mean, at like 4 or 5 years old, he was classified as like a world-class genius. So, I mean, he's really, really smart in terms of the schemes that he pulls. The problem with this is that for the most part, he's usually relegated to a background character. He really is nothing more than just a henchman in almost every single story that he's been written in, which is kind of disappointing because of how how Mark Millar originally built him up. I mean, there's no reason he shouldn't be one of the most formidable villains out there. The question is, how do you use a guy like that in a villain role that is that formidable, which is kind of interesting. But the other half of this is that when it comes to Shin Harada, one thing to bear in mind is that he is very much arrogant. He's very cocky. He's very, youthful and powerful in that regard. And so the result is that where he is able to take out all these members of the Hand pretty quickly, what we end up finding out is this was a distraction. And in fact, it was a distraction from someone called the Scarlet Samurai, which of course basically leads to him being impaled. And then that's really about it. I mean, he's, just more or less kind of defeated, pretty quickly and essentially killed off. And so what we end up doing is we end up jumping back to, a period before this story starts. And we pick up with Gorgon going through the process of resurrection. The Hand's resurrection process is a way for Marvel to basically bring back characters that normally would stay dead. I mean, that's the whole thing. Like, they legitimately die, and then Marvel wants to bring them back. Sometimes the Hand will be the ones to do it. Now, the other half of this is that Gorgon's scheme here is really just trying to find a way to reproduce Regenix, is really all it is. And so breaking into Clan Yoshida, basically taking it over, simply saying that, Gorgon himself alongside the Scarlet Samurai, they're the ones running the show. They begin the process of using Regenix on various Hand soldiers. Now, this is a pretty big deal because instead of someone like Wolverine just tearing through all these members of the Hand, cutting them to pieces and calling it a day, what this would mean is that they can basically heal. So as long as they're not in a place that's exceedingly cold, like if they're not fighting in the Arctic or something along those lines, then there'll be virtually no way to stop the Hand. And that was the whole basis behind it, or at least one of the many practical applications that could be used for it. Now, of course, with Old Man Logan himself having a conversation with the widow of Tuco, this of course leads to Gorgon and Scarlet Samurai showing up and a pretty significant fight breaking out between all of them. But this is when Old Man Logan begins to realize these various members of the Hand are using Regenix. Not only that, in the middle of this fight that he engages in with Scarlet Samurai, he actually loses his hand, which is a pretty big moment because what this basically means is that he, this weapon that Scarlet Samurai is using can cut directly through adamantium. Now, what this material is, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's some sort of Arctic vibranium because as it stands in Marvel Comics, nothing should be able to cut through adamantium. Arctic vibranium can cut through adamantium just because of the fact that it breaks down the adamantium metal on like the atomic level. Is effectively separating the atoms from one another, thereby eliminating vibranium in its entirety because the molecules that make up the adamantium itself begins to just kind of fall apart at the seams. And so that's really kind of the only thing that I can think of, but we're not explicitly told here. So either this is a pretty large oversight or it's the introduction of something new. But it is kind of intriguing because what we of course end up finding out is that Shin Harada had basically survived this entire experience of being like stabbed through the chest and thrown into the garbage. Now again, this is another one of those interesting scenarios because Shin Harada is exceedingly intelligent, but he has no powers, at least not that I'm aware of. He doesn't have any real abilities whatsoever. He's just a really, really skilled swordsman. So it's really just kind of chalked up to the idea of, hey, this is just one of the things they plan for with the various contingencies. I mean, it's very much just kind of asking us to take things at face value. Now, it does create for somewhat of an interesting scenario, and it does really ask some questions. It kind of keeps us on board with regards to, well, how in the world is all this stuff being pulled off? Now, of course, this leads directly to, Old Man Logan basically racing off, because remember, when it comes to his healing factor, it's not like it used to be. I mean, his hand is effectively growing back. It's just not as strong as the healing factor used to be. Now, again, this really kind of brings into sharp relief the nature of his healing factor, and we've talked about that in a separate video, but just for the folks who are kind of new here, the best example I was ever able to use in explaining how this ability works when it comes to Wolverine is like a hammer. If I say, hey, look, here's a hammer that's pretty light, and here is a nail, and I want you to just start hammering this nail, eventually your arm will get tired. And that's what Wolverine's healing factor does. It's not infinite. Because of the fact that he has adamantium in his body, barring the idea that it'll poison him, or him losing his healing factor or something like that, under normal circumstances where there's no type of, additional harm to his body or anything that it can't compensate for, if he lives a long and healthy life, eventually his healing factor will just tire out. And then eventually it won't be able to stop the adamantium that's poisoning his body. Again, that's kind of the whole idea that goes on here. But what we end up having is Old Man Logan, coming back into contact with Shin Harada again. And Shin Harada basically explains the whole backstory behind this, that in truth, the idea of Regenix was never designed to be like a street drug. It was never designed to be something that would be peddled to the highest bidder. It was basically a drug that would be designed to make the world a better place. At the same time, it was also designed to make Shin a lot of money too. So, I mean, that was the whole purpose behind it, was to say, hey, look, this drug could be used by, for military applications. When, military officials send soldiers into the field, they give them temporary healing factors so they can fight longer, they can fight harder. That was the whole idea behind it, was to essentially usher in a new and better world. Now, the problem with this is not only have the Hand taken Regenix and used it for themselves, at least what little samples were left, the shipment that was supposed to, that Wolverine initially stopped in the beginning, that's been sent off to Madripoor. And so what it means is that not only are people in Madripoor going to be able to get the serum, somebody's going to reverse engineer it. And so somebody in turn is going to probably duplicate it and then sell it out there on the market itself, which ushers in a whole new world of problems. But again, because of the fact that Old Man Logan had figured out that cold is basically the best way to essentially slow down the effects of Regenix, when he and Shin Harada basically make their move against Gorgon and the Scarlet Samurai and the Hand, they throw in this giant tank of liquid nitrogen, which is actually kind of cool. Again, this is really something like Old Man Logan would do. I wouldn't really see this being something that Wolverine would do. And that's kind of the distinct difference between these two methods of storytelling. If this story was told in like 1995, for example, Wolverine would just run in there with his claws popped and just tear the Hand apart, probably kill Gorgon and tear apart, Scarlet Samurai, assuming they even managed to survive this long. With Old Man Logan, his healing factor, has to be compensated by his intelligence so that he can basically make up for this now weakness that he has, as opposed to a strength that he used to have. And so it is kind of cool, because with him showing up and facing off, I mean, the Hand, they're made pretty quick work of, just because of the fact that the whole liquid nitrogen kind of cools a place down enough that their healing factors aren't really effective anymore. And then at that point, it's turning his attention to Scarlet Samurai. Now, this is kind of a big deal, because what we had found before was that Scarlet Samurai was actually a girl named Mariko, and I wanted to wait until this moment to talk about that. When it comes to the character of Mariko, she's probably the most significant love interest of Wolverine. And the reason why is because she's really like the first that mattered. I mean, Wolverine had love interests over the course of his life, but Mariko was really the first time that Wolverine had sat down and entertained the idea of walking away from this life that he lived. What he wanted was to basically start a family. Now, of course, that never really happened. Itsu was the person that he had Daken with. But for the character of Mariko, it was more or less just like, hey, look, there's a life better than this. And in fact, he had that for a time. Ultimately, Mariko was poisoned. Wolverine had to kill her in a mercy killing. But again, we're grabbing a lot of this stuff from the main Marvel line of comics and just kind of rolling that history over into Old Man Logan, because there's nothing to indicate that didn't happen. And so because of that, with him having to face off against Mariko like this, there is one part of him that's kind of like, hey, look, you have to come back. But the other part is, well, maybe she can't be saved. He has to kill her because otherwise she's going to kill him. And it's a totally different circumstance. And it's really, really wild in terms of how it plays out, because he has to combat these two things. Now, the whole point of Old Man Logan is to like move on from the past, right? Like to not be locked in the way things used to be, which is a very difficult thing to do. And that's what Old Man Logan was trying to avoid. He was stuck in the wastelands. He was stuck in the family that he used to have. He was stuck in trying to get back. He was always trying to go back, but there is no going back. You can't go back to the way things used to be, because that's the way things used to be. It's not the way they are now. And this is really one of those, the kind of continuation of the Jeff Lemire saga of the past of Old Man Logan is always coming back. It's always coming back to haunt him. In this instance, it's a resurrected Mariko. And so it is interesting, because what ends up happening here is, of course, Gorgon basically just leaves. He essentially takes off, just kind of jumps out the window and says, I'll see you next time. And that's really about the end of him. And then of course, Shin knocks out Mariko, largely because, Old Man Logan asked him not to kill her if it came down to it. And so again, what this does is it allows for a continuation between these two characters. It allows Ed Brisson to basically say, look, the story's going to pick up with these two, because now the most significant love interest of Old Man Man Logan's life is back. And this is cool because what it does is it sets the stage for the future of his character. One of the big questions people have right now is what's going to happen when Old Man Logan meets classic Wolverine, because that story is going to happen eventually. And what will happen when classic Wolverine returns back to being part of the X-Men and so on and so forth? You know, what happens when all that, because it wouldn't make any sense to say, hey guys, classic Wolverine's back, and now he's dead. And, you know, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to do that. So like he's back, he's going to be here for a while, which means you could possibly have two Wolverines, but if you couldn't have two Captain Americas, I don't see why people would say you could have two Wolverines. And so in that instance, something's going to have to happen to Old Man Logan. Like he's probably going to have to go away, which would be disappointing, but this would allow for that, right? Like Mariko finally returns to normal and Old Man Logan says, look, I want to live now. Let's settle down. Let's go start a family and I'll just be out of the picture and I'll never be seen or heard from in Marvel Comics again. I have no idea, but it does kind of tease that possibility. You know, it does tease that idea because what ends up happening is that at this last little tidbit, Shin basically tasks Old Man Logan and Mariko with going to Madripoor and basically siphoning out and eliminating the last little bit of Regenix, or at least to bring some back and eliminate those who got their hands on it. Is really, you know, how this little bit of a continuation goes on. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like and I will catch you all later. Peace.